Hey everybody, welcome back. We're going to be talking about repositories now using GitHub Desktop. So obviously GitHub Desktop needs to be able to handle repositories. Of course it does. And really the main functions for managing your repositories are creating a new one and then adding repositories that already exist, whether they exist on your machine or they exist in the cloud on GitHub already. Okay, so first we're going to look at creating those repositories. And I'll show you this kind of on the slides first, and we'll go into a demo of all of them. So to create one in GitHub Desktop, you look for this little plus icon on the very top left. And when you drop that down, you have the option to create. It asks you for the local path, and it populates that by default with the path that you chose in the options, so that's good. This is where you give it a nice short name, and you can start with a gitignore file, and then you just click create repository. Now, it is a good idea to choose that gitignore template here, something that makes sense, and it's also going to create for you a git attributes in this version, so you'll get those two files right out of the box. It doesn't automatically create the README like it does when you create it online, but that's fine. Now, you also might want to clone a repository. That is, one already exists online, and you just want to pull it down local to your machine. There's two ways to do that. First of all, if it's one of your repositories, either in your personal account or it's in an organizational account that you're a part of, then you can clone that through GitHub Desktop through the UI, which again we'll look at. But if it's just some random repo on GitHub, you've never seen it before, you're not affiliated with it, and you just want to go clone it, obviously that's something that you can just do on the command line with any Git URL. If you want to do it that way, the easiest way is to go to the browser and go to that repository, and then there's an easy button to click and download this, and then open it in Desktop. Okay. Finally, you might want to add repositories that already exist on your machine. So they might not have anything to do with GitHub. Maybe they're repositories that you're never going to put into GitHub, but they're on your machine and you want to manage them with Git Desktop, and that's just fine. GitHub Desktop does not just work with GitHub. It works with Git repositories. So they can be your own repositories that aren't even in GitHub at all. So to do that, you just click on the Add button and you add the local path and say Add Repository. And now this is going to be tracked inside of GitHub Desktop. And finally, if you want to add a lot of repositories at once on your local machine, you probably don't want to do those one at a time. So you go back into Options and look for that Scan for Repositories. And when you click that, it's going to look on your entire hard drive and find any folders that have a Git repo inside. Okay? How about a demo? Let's look at managing repositories. So I'm going to go ahead and open GitHub Desktop. That's the GitHub with the Octocat icon. The nice purple Octocat icon. Looks real nice. Now when I open GitHub Desktop, mine already has a bunch of repos over here on the left. It's deceiving because GitHub Desktop is not, to be honest, part of my daily flow. I tend to do things from the command line and using my IDE. But I did scan for all my repositories and it's brought them in here. So let's first look at creating a new repository. Here's that plus that I told you about. I'm going to choose Create. And now here under my root directory, I'm going to create one called GHD for GitHub Desktop Create. It's just what we're going to call it. It's under code. I'm going to pretend that this is going to start as a node project. And so it's going to give me a gitignore that has some typical ignore patterns for a node application. Go ahead and create that. Now it's created it on my machine and it's also brought it into GitHub Desktop. So now that one is down here, GHD create. Why is it on the bottom of the list instead of up here under GitHub? That is because all of the ones that are up here they do exist out on GitHub, whereas the ones on the bottom have been created locally, but I've not yet published them.
And that's an important distinction to make. So earlier in Module 2, we were working entirely on GitHub.com, entirely on that remote version of the repository. And what Jeremy's doing, he created it locally and is now going to sync that and create a remote repository on GitHub.com. So when you mentioned there's some that are displayed under GitHub, this one's Git, but it's on GitHub Desktop. You know, how is it different? Well, if I were to go on GitHub and look for this repo, it's not there yet, right? So that local and remote distinction is really important.
And when I publish this, when I put this into the cloud, it exists looking exactly like I have it now, but it contains all of my history of how I got it there. So if I just start with an empty directory and I do some proof of concept and build up a product that kind of looks remotely similar to what we're going to be building together, and then I publish it, you still have all that history. So it really doesn't matter whether you start it local or start it in the cloud or start it on multiple machines or whatever, because everybody has all the history. That shows off one of those big advantages of a distributed environment. So it's not published yet, but we have this big publish button on the top right, and I can go ahead and hit publish. It's going to ask me once again for a description. We saw that that's optional, and for now I'll skip it. It's not a private repository that I'm doing here, and I'm going to go ahead and publish that. And now that's pushing that up to GitHub. Now this went up by default because I'm logged in as myself. This pushed this up to my local or to my user account on GitHub. So Brianna, why don't you go ahead and jump to github.com/codefoster and /GHD-create and make sure that you can see that one there.
I can. Yep, so I just went there. I can see there's been one commit, there's one branch. If I look at the history of commits under this code tab, we can even click on some more detail, and it'll show us the changes that were made in that commit. So it's 2 files, which were just the git attributes and that git ignore.
Wonderful.
Yeah, everything's up there.
That's great. Okay, now let's follow one more pretty similar workflow to that. That one I started inside of GitHub Desktop, but I'm just going to jump into my shell, and I'm inside this code directory here, and I'm going to start my repository right here. Sometimes I follow this workflow, maybe I'm following instructions online or whatever, but I'm going to create GHD command line. So we'll call this GHD-CLI. Silly name, but I'm going to go ahead and make that directory and then change into it. And now inside of here, I'm going to create a Git repository. If you've never seen that before, it's very simply git init. Now what that does is it looks like it's done nothing. It doesn't look like there's anything in that repository. Actually, if I jump out to this in Windows Explorer, I have my hidden files showing, so you can see this hidden .git file folder that it has created for me. So this is in fact a Git repository. You can tell because my command line, and by the way, I'm not using git shell here, but I'm loading the PS1 file that git shell does in my own shell, so that I kind of always have git shell whenever I open my own terminal. And so you can see that it recognizes this is a repository because it shows me which branch I'm on. And if I create a file, let me go ahead and touch a.txt. I've created a file, and now it shows me the change. It shows me that there's that change there. But now I want to work in GitHub Desktop, and it doesn't have that repository, so that's where you want to add one. You go back into the plus, add, and here you put the local path to this, so that was under code under GHD CLI. It sees that it's a repository, and allows me to create that. Now, it makes sense that that is under other down here because that has not been published to GitHub. And once again, I may never publish that to GitHub, and I can still manage it in GitHub Desktop. So that's managing repositories using GitHub Desktop. We have more to look at, but we'll do that soon. Do you have anything else you wanted to add there?
No, I think you pretty much covered it. GitHub Desktop is a great way to get your repositories working locally in something other than the command line.
And I like that I have the choice. I can do it in the browser or in desktop. I can do it right there at the command line. Do it wherever I feel comfortable.
Exactly right.
All right.